The peaceful streets of Maplewood gated community were shattered by the sound of blaring sirens. An ambulance skidded to a stop, paramedics rushing to save a teenage boy's life. But just as they reached for their medical kits, a furious voice cut through the air. Karen Wilkins, the HOA president from hell, stormed outside, demanding that the ambulance move immediately. She didn't care that a boy was unconscious inside the house. She didn't care that every second mattered. All she cared about was that the ambulance was parked in her precious reserved space. She had no idea who was inside that ambulance, or that this was about to become the biggest mistake of her life. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Inside the house, Tom Jacobs, the teenage son of the state governor, lay unconscious on the living room floor. His mother, Sarah, had called 911 moments ago, her hands shaking as she pleaded for help. Now she could see through the window her lifeline being delayed over a parking spot. The paramedics exchanged incredulous glances. "You've got to be kidding me," muttered Marcus. "Lady, move out of the way. A boy is having a medical emergency." "I don't care who's dying," Karen interrupted, jabbing her finger toward the curb. "This is my property. My HOA reserves this space for me. You are violating our community rules." Marcus clenched his jaw. His partner, Lisa, was already grabbing supplies and moving toward the house, determined not to waste another second. But Karen wasn't done. "If you don't move, I'm calling the police." The word seemed to hang in the air for a moment before Marcus let out a sharp, humorous laugh. "Go ahead," he said, shaking his head. "Call them?" Karen didn't hesitate. She whipped out her phone and dialed 911. The absurdity of the situation seemed lost on her as she furiously relayed her complaint to the dispatcher. "Yes, I'd like to report an illegally parked vehicle," she huffed. "It's completely blocking my property, and they refuse to leave." A pause. "Well, it's an ambulance, but that doesn't matter. They have no right to take my space." The dispatcher, likely struggling to process what they were hearing, asked her to clarify the situation. "Yes, I live in Maplewood, a gated community, and we have strict HOA regulations about parking. This ambulance is violating those rules." By now, the neighbors were peeking out from their homes, watching the spectacle unfold. It wasn't the first time Karen had thrown a tantrum over trivial matters. She was notorious for policing, issuing unauthorized IED fines, and even calling animal control on someone's dog for barking in the middle of the day. But this, calling the cops on an ambulance, this was a new level of insanity. The front door of the Jacobs house flung open, and Sarah rushed out, her face pale with panic. "What is going on?" she gasped, her voice breaking. "My son is inside. He needs help. Please." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically, waving a dismissive hand at her. "They're parked in my space," Sarah said, as if that were a reasonable explanation. "I don't make the rules, okay? But we all have to follow them. If I let this slide, then what's next? Delivery trucks? People leaving their cars wherever they please? Chaos." Sarah's lips trembled as she stared at the woman, who cared more about a patch of asphalt than a human life. "You're unbelievable," she whispered. Karen sniffed. "I enforce the rules fairly." Marcus had had enough. He brushed past Karen and headed inside, ignoring her continued ranting. His partner had already begun administering aid to Tom, who was barely breathing. Meanwhile, Karen remained planted in the street, phone still pressed her ear. "Yes, officer, I'm being threatened now," she exaggerated, glancing around the growing crowd of onlookers. "Yes, they're refusing to comply with HOA regulations." "Exactly, thank you. Please send someone right away." As she hung up, she turned to the nearest neighbor, a younger man named Jake, who had his arms crossed, shaking his head. "Can you believe this?" Karen scoffed. "This is why rules exist, so people can't take advantage like this." Jake let out a dry chuckle. "You just called 911 on an ambulance." Karen's expression hardened. "It's about principle." "No," he said flatly. "It's about you being an insane control freak." Karen gasped, clearly offended, but before she could retort, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Again, a police cruiser rolled up the scene. Officer Daniels, a tall, broad-shouldered man with years of experience dealing with entitled citizens, stepped out. His eyes flickered between the parked ambulance and the smug expression on Karen's face. "Who called this in?" he asked. Karen marched forward, head held high. "That would be me. Officer, I need you to remove that vehicle immediately." Daniels blinked. "You called 911 on an ambulance?" "Yes," she said, folding her arms. "They're violating HOA rules." Silence. The kind of silence that carries the weight of pure disbelief. Daniels let out a slow exhale. "Ma'am, are you serious right now?" Karen's confidence wavered. "Well, yes. This is a gated community, and rules must be followed." Before she could finish, Jake burst out laughing. "Dude," he said between chuckles, addressing the officer, "you have no idea how bad she is." The other neighbors murmured in agreement, nodding. Daniels turned back to Karen, his patience already wearing thin. "Let me get this straight," he said. "A boy, the governor's son, is inside having a medical emergency, and you want me to ticket or tow the vehicle saving his life because you think HOA rules overrule city ordinances." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, yes." Daniels stared at her for a long moment before finally speaking. "Ma'am," he said loud enough for the whole street to hear, "I've been a police officer for 15 years, and this might be the dumbest complaint I've ever responded to." The crowd erupted in laughter. Karen's face turned beet red, but Daniel wasn't done. "You're lucky I don't charge you for misusing emergency services. I suggest you take a step back and let the professionals do their job, or you might be the one needing an ambulance next." The weight of public humiliation settled on Karen's shoulders as her carefully crafted facade of HOA authority crumbled in an instant, and she had no idea the worst was yet to come. Inside the house, Marcus and Lisa were still working on Tom, stabilizing him and preparing to transport him to the hospital. Every second mattered. Daniel turned to them. "How's the patient?" Marcus, who was beyond done with Karen, responded without missing a beat. "Well, he would have been in the hospital by now if we hadn't been delayed by a lunatic blocking our vehicle." The crowd burst into murmurs. Karen gasped dramatically. "That is defamation. I was simply—" "Ma'am," Daniel interrupted. "Step aside now." Karen's mouth fell open. "Excuse me? I am an HOA official. You do not speak to me that way." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "You're an HOA member, not law enforcement. You don't get to interfere with an act of emergency." Karen's fingers twitched around her phone. "Fine, then issue them a citation. I want them fined for breaking our HOA's parking policy." Daniel folded his arms. "You want me to issue a citation to paramedics for parking while saving a boy's life?" "Yes." Daniel stared at her. The entire neighborhood stared at her. Even the dispatcher on the radio, who had been listening and let out a tiny, barely suppressed chuckle. "Ma'am," Daniel finally said, "I've been a cop for 15 years, and this might be the stupidest call I've ever responded to." Laughter exploded from the crowd. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. "What?" "No, I am enforcing rules." Daniel exhaled sharply. "No, what you're doing is interfering with emergency services, which is a crime." Karen's smugness evaporated. "Oh, a crime," she stammered. "Yes, ma'am. And if you keep obstructing this emergency response, I will have no choice but to escort you to the station." Karen paled. The neighbors, now openly filming, cheered. "Finally," someone shouted. "About time someone put her in her place." Another voice added, "Hope the HOA sees this and kicks her out." Karen's panicking turned to Officer Daniels with an exaggerated look of distress. "Officer, I'm being harassed. This is an attack on my character." Daniels crossed his arms. "No, this is the consequence of your own actions." Karen let out a strangled noise. "This isn't fair." Daniels sighed, clearly done with her theatrics. "You know what else isn't fair? A boy almost dying while you whine about a parking space." The mention of Tom sobered the crowd a little. The ambulance was gone now, racing toward the hospital, but everyone knew how serious his condition had been. Sarah, Tom's mother, stepped forward, her eyes still wet from tears, but her voice was steady and full of anger. "My son could have died because of you," she said. her voice carrying pure rage. Karen visibly flinched. I didn't mean... You didn't mean what? Sarah's voice rose. Didn't mean to delay life-saving care over a damn parking space. Didn't mean to waste police resources on your pathetic power trip. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. You don't care about this community, and you never have, Sarah continued. You just love controlling people. The neighbors murmured in agreement. Yeah, remember when she fined me for leaving my trash bin out 30 minutes past pickup? One said, when she tried to ban holiday decorations because she thought they looked tacky. She reported my kids for disturbing the peace because they were playing outside. The floodgates opened, and suddenly it was Karen versus the entire community. Officer Daniels looked mildly amused. Sounds like you made quite a reputation for yourself. Karen's eyes darted around wildly as she realized that no one was coming to her defense. Even the other HOA board members stood silently, watching her downfall. Then came the final nail in the coffin. Mr. Langford, the HOA president, stepped forward. He was an older man, usually reserved and neutral in neighborhood disputes, but today his face was stone cold. Karen, he said simply, we need to talk. Karen stiffened. Langford, oh, thank goodness. You need to. He held up a hand. No, Karen, you need to listen. You have embarrassed this community beyond repair. You put our entire HOA in the spotlight for the worst possible reasons. Karen froze. What? What are you saying? Langford let out a long sigh. I just got off the phone with the HOA's legal team. They have advised that we hold an emergency meeting to discuss your removal from the board. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen stumbled back. No, you can't. I am the only one who enforces the rules. That's the problem, Langford said. You enforce rules that only benefit you, and now you become a liability. Karen shook her head frantically. You can't do this. The HOA needs me. Jake, still filming, chuckled. Yeah, pretty sure they don't. Langford ignored her protests. The emergency meeting is set for tomorrow evening. I suggest you prepare. Karen looked like she might pass out. This is a witch hunt. Daniels chuckled. No, ma'am. This is accountability. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Karen turned on her heel and stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. The moment she disappeared, the entire neighborhood burst into celebration. Jake turned back to the camera. Well, there you have it, folks. HOA Karen finally gets what's coming to her. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more neighborhood drama. Daniels let out a long sigh. Swear HOA calls are the worst. Sarah wiped her tears and finally smiled. I just hope Tom gets the care he needs. Marcus, the paramedic who had been standing nearby, nodded. He will. And hey, looks like the neighborhood emergency is finally getting handled too. The crowd laughed again. For the first time in years, Maplewood Gated Community felt like it might actually become a neighborhood worth living in. And for Karen, this was only the beginning of the end. The HOA emergency meeting was set for 7 p.m. sharp, but by 6:30, the community center was already packed. Residents, some who had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives, crammed into every seat, eager to witness what would undoubtedly be the most satisfying downfall in Maplewood history. Karen Wilkins, the self-appointed dictator of the neighborhood, was finally facing judgment. The usual dullness of HOA meetings discussing landscaping budgets and pet waste regulations was replaced with an electrified tension. Conversations buzzed through the room, neighbors exchanging stories of the years of pettiness and harassment they had endured under Karen's rule. Even some former residents had shown up, having heard the viral news. At 6:55, Karen stormed in, her face pinched in an expression of indignant rage. She was dressed for battle. A stiff blazer, an oversized HOA badge pinned to her chest like a military medal, and a thick binder of documents clutched tightly in her arms. Despite everything, she still believed she could win. She still believed she was untouchable. As she stomped toward the front row, she shot glares at every neighbor who dared make eye contact. The whispers around her didn't stop. She's actually showing her face. She still thinks she's in charge. She's delusional. The HOA board sat at the long table on the raised platform at the front of the room, their expressions grim. Mr. Langford, the HOA president, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. All right, let's get this meeting started. Karen shot to her feet before he could continue. Before we begin, I would like to make a formal statement. Langford sighed, but waved a hand. Fine, let's hear it. Karen stepped forward, clutching her binder. What happened yesterday was a gross misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion by online harassment and fake news. I was simply following HOA protocol, which, might I remind you, is what this board exists to enforce. She flipped open her binder dramatically, pulling out a printed copy of the HOA bylaws. Our official parking regulations state that personal vehicles are not permitted to park in reserved spaces without authorization. You called 911 on an ambulance, someone shouted from the back. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Karen's eye twitched. Excuse me, I was speaking. Langford sighed again. Karen, we've all seen the footage. There is no misunderstanding here. Karen slammed her binder shut. That footage was taken without my consent. I demand it be removed immediately. Jake, who was sitting near the front, chuckled. Yeah, that's not how the internet works, sweetheart. The room erupted into laughter again. Karen's face turned scarlet. This is harassment. I have served this community for years. I have kept it clean, organized, and free from chaos. Langford held up a hand. Karen, this meeting isn't about your contributions. It's about whether or not you should remain on this board. Karen laughed a short, high-pitched cackle. You can't remove me. I was elected. Langford nodded. Yes, and now we will hold a vote on whether to remove you. Karen's confidence faltered for the first time. Langford turned to the community. Before we vote, let's go over some of the complaints that have been filed against Karen over the years. He pulled out a stack of papers, flipping through them. In the past 5 years, Karen has issued 127 citations to homeowners for minor infractions, including but not limited to leaving their trash cans out 5 minutes past pickup time, using the wrong shade of blue for their mailbox, having an offensively large Halloween decoration, letting their kids use sidewalk chalk, and parking their own driveway in a way she deemed unsightly. Laughter and groans filled the room. This is ridiculous, Karen muttered. Langford continued. She has fined elderly residents who forgot to cut their grass due to hospital stays, threatened to tow cars belonging to visiting family members. And let's not forget she has attempted to ban holiday decorations because they didn't match her vision for the neighborhood aesthetic. Because they were tacky. Karen shouted, Tacky? Langford ignored her. But most importantly, he said, Karen deliberately delayed a medical emergency response, and when questioned by law enforcement, doubled down. Karen's eyes darted across the room. Nobody was on her side. Even the board members who had once supported her refused to meet her gaze. She was losing. Langford exhaled. All in favor of removing Karen Wilkins from the HOA board effective immediately. The room erupted in a sea of raised hands. Karen gasped. Those opposed. Not a single hand. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Langford nodded. Motion passes. Effective immediately, Karen Wilkins is removed from her position on the HOA board. The room exploded into applause. Karen looked around wildly as if expecting someone to step in and save her, but no one did. Her power was gone. Jake leaned toward her with a grin. Well, there goes your reign of terror. Karen snapped. You can't do this to me, she screeched. I am this neighborhood. Langford gathered his papers. Karen, you can leave now. Karen stumbled back, shaking her head furiously. This isn't over, she hissed. I'll get a lawyer. I'll sue every single one of you. Jake, still recording, grinned. Oh, please do. That'll just get more people to see your meltdown. Karen's eyes twitched violently. She had never felt this powerless. She let out a furious scream, grabbed her binder, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. Cheers erupted as neighbors high-fived. Laughter filled the air. For the first time in years, the community felt free. Langford rubbed his temples. Well, that was exhausting, he said. Jake grinned. Hey, at least we don't have to deal with her anymore. Langford sighed. Actually, I think we might. Jake frowned. What do you mean? Langford pointed out the window. Karen stood in the parking lot. Phone pressed to her ear. Even from inside, they could hear her screaming into the receiver. 911, yes. I need to report an entire neighborhood conspiring against me. Jake burst out laughing. Oh my God, she's actually calling the cops on the HOA. And just like that, Karen's descent into absolute madness continued. Karen stormed to the parking lot, her rage boiling over as she barked into her phone. The neighborhood had turned against her. The HOA had kicked her out, and now she was going to make them pay. Yes, 911. I need to report a case of organized harassment, she shrieked into the receiver. The 911 operator, who had likely been briefed on Karen's antics from the previous night, sighed audibly on the other end. Ma'am, is this about the HOA vote? Karen's face twitched. It's about an entire community conspiring against me. Another pause. Then the operator hung up. Karen stared at her phone in shock. Did they just hang up on me? From the community center windows, Jake and several neighbors burst into laughter. Oh, this is better than TV, he cackled, zooming in with his phone. Karen spun around, realizing she had an audience. Why? You're all just jealous, she screeched. Jealous because I had power and order, and now you're going to turn this place into a trashy, lawless wasteland. Nobody even acknowledged her tantrum. The neighbors were too busy celebrating. They clinked glasses, shook hands, and cheered over the downfall of the most hated woman in the neighborhood. Just when Karen thought her night couldn't get any worse, a tow truck pulled into the lot. A burly driver stepped out, clipboard in hand. He looked around confused before spotting Karen. You Karen's Wilkins? Karen blinked. Yes, what do you want? The driver tilted his head. Yeah, I'm here to tow your car. Silence. Karen's brain short-circuited. Wow, what? You can't tow my car. I didn't do anything wrong. The driver checked his clipboard. Says here you have outstanding HOA fines. Karen's breath caught. The very organization she ruled over had been stacking violations against her. What fines? She asked, suddenly feeling dizzy. The driver squinted at his paperwork. Multiple citations. Let's see. Leaving Christmas decorations up past the HOA deadline. Failing to properly trim your hedges. An unauthorized garden gnome. Jake choked on his drink. A gnome. Oh my God. Her own rules had come back to bite her. The crowd erupted into laughter. Karen's head snapped up. No, this is a mistake. Those fines were voided. I was on the board. The tow truck driver shrugged. Yeah, well, you're not anymore and nobody paid these. He gestured at her car, a shiny Lexus SUV. The entire world crumbled. This is theft, she shrieked. You can't do this. The driver ignored her, hopping into his truck. With a loud clanking of chains, he secured her car and began lifting it onto the truck bed. Karen threw herself onto the hood, screaming, No! Stop! I have money. I can pay it now. The driver, completely unfazed, tapped his clipboard. Says here you have to pay through the HOA office, which, you just got kicked out of. Jake burst out laughing so hard he had to lean against a tree. Oh my God, this is peak irony. Neighbors whipped out their phones, capturing every second as Karen clawed at the hood of her car, screaming, This is a crime. Someone called the police. Daniels, the same officer from the ambulance incident, stepped outside, sipping a coffee. He took one look at Karen melodramatically draped over her car, sighed, and shook his head. Ma'am, he called, walking over, I really think you should take the L and go home. Karen twisted around wildly. You have to stop them. Daniels raised an eyebrow. I don't have to do anything. The tow is legal. Karen let out an ear-piercing screech. I'll have this entire neighborhood shut down. Jake leaned toward Daniels. Can you actually shut down a neighborhood? Daniels smirked. Nope. More laughter followed. The tow truck driver honked the horn. Ma'am, you gotta move, or am I dragging this thing with you on it? Karen froze. The realization hit her. She was powerless. Her title was gone. Her authority was gone. And her own car was about to be gone too. Her reign of terror was officially over. With shaking hands, she peeled herself off the hood, glaring at the laughing neighbors. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You'll all regret this." Jake grinned. "Oh, I doubt that." The tow truck pulled away, Karen's precious Lexus disappearing into the night. She stood there, trembling with fury, humiliation, and disbelief. Langford, still inside the community center, watched the whole thing unfold. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Well, that takes care of that." Marcus, the paramedic, chuckled. "You know, karma has never worked faster." The crowd cheered. First night without her in charge, and it's already the best day of the year. A small celebration broke out. Someone brought champagne, and someone else turned on music. Neighbors who had never spoken before laughed together, bonded by the shared victory over Karen. She stood in the empty lot, fists clenched, seething. Her entire empire had collapsed in less than 48 hours, and the entire world had seen it. Her meltdown video was already trending on social media. "How Karen Gets Publicly Humiliated After Calling 911 on an Ambulance," read one headline. "Entitled Woman Loses Everything After Power Trip Goes Too Far," read another. Millions of views. Karen stared at her phone, her own face plastered across every platform, mocked by strangers across the globe. She let out one final furious scream before storming off into the night. And just like that, Maplewood was finally free. The next morning, Maplewood Gate community felt different for the first time in years. There was no passive-aggressive HOA email about trivial infractions. No Karens marching to the streets with a clipboard, handing out warnings for overgrown hedges or unsightly doormats. The air felt lighter. People left their trash bins out a little longer just because they could. Kids played on the sidewalks without fear of being fined for loitering. Some even parked in Karen's former reserve spot just out of pure spite. It was a new era at the community center. The HOA board held a follow-up meeting to discuss the next steps. Langford sat at the head of the table, looking more relaxed than he had in years. "All right," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Now that the tyrant is gone, we need to clean up the mess she left behind." The board members nodded. "First order of business," Langford continued. "We're canceling every single petty fine she issued." Cheers erupted in the room. Jake, who had been documenting the entire saga, smirked. "Even the garden gnome fine?" "Especially the garden gnome fine," Langford confirmed. More cheers. The new HOA board members, actual reasonable people, went to work repealing the worst of Karen's ridiculous rules. Holiday decorations were no longer restricted. Sidewalk chalk was allowed. Visitor parking was no longer a Karen-controlled nightmare. Complaints about aesthetic violations were tossed out unless they were actual issues. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. People actually talked to each other, celebrating their newfound freedom. Sarah, still relieved that her son Tom had made it through his medical emergency, smiled as she watched kids riding bikes in the cul-de-sac. "Feels like a real neighborhood again," she murmured. Jake nodded. "Yeah, and the best part." He pulled out his phone, flipping it around to show the viral status of the HOA Karen's videos. 10 million views. HOA Karen's meltdown is officially internet history. Sarah laughed. Serves her right. Meanwhile, Karen was nowhere to be seen. After her public meltdown, she had locked herself inside her house, refusing to come outside. But the internet wasn't letting her disappear quietly. Her ranting live streams had been clipped, edited, and turned into memes. One of the most popular remixes was a video titled "Karen versus the Ambulance," auto-tuned, featuring her infamous quote, "You can't park here. I don't care who's dying," with a catchy beat behind it. Even major news stations had picked up the story, turning her into a cautionary tale of HOA power gone too far. Karen Wilkins was now the most hated person in the HOA world. But karma wasn't finished with her yet. That afternoon, a moving truck was spotted outside Karen's house. Jake grinned as he watched from his front porch. "Oh, this just keeps getting better." Karen stormed out her house, still looking furious. She saw the neighbors watching her and, instead of slinking away quietly, made one final stand. "You think you've won," she shrieked. "This neighborhood will fall apart without me. You need me." Someone from the crowd shouted back, "No." Karen's face twisted in fury, but she had no comeback. With one last huff, she climbed into her car, which she had to get back after paying all her own fines, and sped off. Jake, always ready, filmed the entire thing. And there it is, folks, the end of the HOA Karen's reign. She's finally gone. The video racked up another 1,000,000 views within hours. Maplewood was officially free. As the dust settled, Jake sat back, grinning at his phone screen. His video series on Karen's downfall had taken off way beyond expectations. In the comments, people shared their own horror stories of HOA nightmares, celebrating one of the greatest Karens of all time getting exactly what she deserved. With a final smirk, Jake hit record one last time. Karen had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, convinced she was untouchable. But this time, she picked the wrong fight. The moment the police, the governor's office, and the entire community turned against her, her HOA reign crumbled overnight. The rules she had used to control others came back to destroy her own life, leaving her humiliated, powerless, and completely alone. And the best part? Maplewood finally became a real community again. No more petty fines, no more ridiculous rules. Just neighbors finally free from Karen's iron grip. Because in the end, tyrants always fall, and justice always finds a way.